Hello, Charles.
Hey, Rem. Yo.
Yo, Charles. Basically, you are the writer of many, many books, and we will inevitably talk about them. And we want to talk about London in every case, so perhaps the first question I would like to ask you, whether the messiness of London and the kind of incoherence of the city alerted you to the aesthetic and the virtues of the postmodern, and was in any way responsible for your insight into the postmodern condition?
Absolutely. Rasmussen, the Stein-Eiler Rasmussen, I guess he's Danish, architectural historian, urbanist, wrote a book called London, the Unique City in the 20s. And it's unique, and it remains unique in a sense, because it's a series of villages. And these villages, if you look at them from the air, or you look at them from a point of view of ethnicity, or you look at them in terms of different kinds of consumer groups, or on any index of diversity, you get an incredible patchwork quilt that is irreducibly pluralist. And it's very similar, actually, to Los Angeles, where I used to live for 25 years. Los Angeles has the greatest diversity index of any place. At least it did. New York was supposed to be number one, and you wrote on that in Delirious New York with 2,028 superblocks. And that was called on the melting pot or boiling pot. And in that image, it made Los Angeles a kind of, pizza with all the extras. And London becomes even more, apparently, according to sociologists, and if you look this up on the web, the Guardian index of minorities in Britain, you'll find that London has a shape rather like that I illustrate in my book on Heteropolis on Los Angeles. It has an incredible amount, 100 different ethnic groups. Now, those ethnicities are very stripped down to British categories, which are full of euphemisms, by the way, and false categories. But they still show 100 different groups. I can start mentioning them from, Australians to Zimbabweans. But of course, Americans, and I'm American, as you probably can hear, Americans, when I came here, there were 100,000 Americans in London. Now they don't call us a minority anymore. They don't even keep... So we've disappeared like you. You're from London, and you're Dutch. You don't appear as a minority either, Rem. So what I'm trying to say is this incredible diversity is, of course, the postmodern condition, the number one part of it that everybody agrees on, this pluralism. And it seems to me a city is a mechanism for sustaining difference. And I think you see after 7/7, after July 7th last year, that amazingly sophisticated people in these minorities know that London is a kind of place of diversity, and they didn't panic and they didn't turn against each other. And that shows that the people of London have a very good self-awareness, what they used to be called in the 60s the knowing consumer. I think that the Londoners are the most heteropolitan people in the world, so I'm really happy to live here and talk about it.
As you mentioned, some of your books, actually, the book which we've discussed most, with Rem preparing this marathon of your books is Meaning in Architecture, which I think is particularly interesting in relation to it proposing a different kind of rule of the game, how a book can work, similarly to, what the marathon tries to do in terms of a conference or a symposium. Also, the kind of idea of the book being a machine. You said once that what kind of machine could be adequate to the present, and so it's a kind of a very polyphonic way of dealing with the authors in the book. So I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about Meaning in Architecture and how the rule of the game of that book has kind of worked.
Well, that was written in 1969 at a period when meaning was being denied in architecture, and George Baird and I, who edited it, had a lot of time between the writing of it. It was written by 14 people, and the publication. So we decided to send it out to all the contributors and have them comment on each other at the most vulnerable place in a text, with a little arrow saying, for instance, Rayner Banham, you're completely wrong. That's what George Baird would say. And then Banham would answer it in another little arrow going against Baird. Well, here's, go back to Canada and learn about architecture or something. So a very rude hypertext. It was one of the first hypertexts, I think. And it came out of this notion that difference and pluralism makes meaning. In other words, people always used to think that what we wanted in culture, I mean, the Prince Charles view, the classical view, even the reigning view of modernists, is that what we want is unanimity. And what we want is some kind of consensus. Well, one doesn't have to exaggerate dissensus or disagreement to realize that conversation, which is what you intend to have here, conversation, the enjoyable quality of a conversation is about difference. If we didn't disagree, have some difference, then we couldn't converse. It's like a battery. If you're a plus charge, I'm a minus charge, we can exchange energy. But if we're both minus, where do we go from there? So for me, the city, like Edinburgh in the 18th century, the great example of this is, you had the Enlightenment started at dining tables, conversing. And if you couldn't converse and keep the conversation going, then you weren't invited back. And I think that's the name of a city.
I want to I think your character is, in a way, seemingly smooth, but there are two, for me, recognizable sides. You as an actor and as somebody who converses and who is provocative, playful, etc., etc. But I think there's also you, which is more kind of rigorous and however much you may hate the word, dogmatic. And I want to kind of really bring this in focus, these two sides about your preoccupation with the future. I think that no one has invested so much energy in a career in predicting facts, in predicting trends, in predicting events, in predicting, basically in predicting the future. None of us would dare to make that such a crucial part of their career. And recently you told me that actually you have a kind of very high success rates, between 70 and 80%. And so what we all think is a kind of playful game for you to predict the future is in fact pretty much a life and death kind of situation of almost grim precision. Can you say something about these two sides of you, or why it is so important that the futures you predict actually happen?
Well, maybe as opposed to Brian Eno, I believe in telos, teleology, in unfolding the predictability of events. As I talked to you about this before, but in 2003, in January, a group of architects, of which you were one, signed a petition against war, and we predicted 5 things that would happen if Bush took Blair, and Blair took some others to Iraq. And all 5 things happened, uncannily, almost exactly as we wrote in that letter, an open letter that was published. And I think a lot of international relations are predictable. And again, it's a cliche of our time that with global warming, it's a 50-year super tanker, as Brian said, that can't be turned around. It takes 20 years to turn it around, if it's ever going to turn. Well, we have apocalypse fatigue at the moment because there are so many negatives that are both happening and predicted for our future that since you and I, Rem, and not you, you're too young, are people from the 60s where the apocalypse, in a sense, started at home. We've been predicting, in a sense, this meltdown for such a long time that we have apocalypse fatigue. Now, I do believe that we've got to invent humorous, enjoyable, funny metaphors for getting over that fatigue. Because I see globalization like John Gray, the philosopher here in London, who says, whatever you think about globalization, don't be fooled. In global meltdowns, there's going to be incredible difference in outcomes. Just as there are 5 or 6 capitalisms around the world struggling, competing, there's not a single way it's going. So we have to predict what are the 5 possible outcomes, and what are the likely ones, and then be critical of it. And so I see prediction as a critical tool in order to get a fulcrum on politics and the future. The best predictions wouldn't be true because they would be countered by our actions if we were effective politically. So I see prediction and intervention as 2 parts of the same coin, and and that figure of getting it right 80% of the time, of course, is ridiculous and made up by me. But I can't, I looked at I wrote a book on the year 2000 in 1969, and I rewrote it in the year 2000 to see what came true. And to my score, 80% came true, but I'm sure if you ask Ken Frampton, about 5% came true. So never judge the author.
I have another question. You're primarily an intellectual, I would say, a writer, but recently you've also become a designer, or you have been a designer for a very long time, but design seems to become more important as part of your repertoire. Can you say something about that, your emergence as a designer, and why it is happening, and what you think you can contribute fundamentally which you cannot contribute as a writer?
Well, Rem, I started off designing and writing, and like you did, and I think that they are, again, 2 sides of a thing. Also, that my design has always been marginal. I'm a writer who architects, if you like, a writer who designs, rather than a designer who writes. So but I think that you gain insight if you struggle with design and you face things which you wouldn't face if you were just a writer. So I find Le Corbusier is my model of a man who developed different parts of his character, his brain, and his activity through painting and all the rest of it. I think that it's multimodal, and writing and design inform each other, because the design has to be predictive of the future, has to be, in a certain sense, utopian, in a certain sense, ideal, in a certain sense, critical. And so, projectively, I found that by designing, my design's very, very dogmatic, as you would say, and to do with the necessity of having iconography. I think one of the most evasive things of our time is our inability to come up with content, something you talk about, which is intersubjective and fought over and believed in. So, I'm dogmatically committed to seeing if there are things that you can really have design about. And of course, I've come up with all these ideas about nature and the universe. So I'm a dogmatist about cosmogenic art, which I'm happy to bore you with if you keep asking me.
Can you maybe give us an example in terms of your house? Because Rem has told me a lot about your house, which sort of evolutively seems to have added chapter by chapter. Could you tell us about how this works?
Yeah, well, I'm a bit embarrassed to talk about my house, but again, experimenting on myself, it's a cosmic house, thematic house. You enter the door, there are 28 themes. You come in, each one is written, and it starts off over your head with a bang, and then the universe evolves around you, and it ends in this was designed in 1979 to 1984, and it was designed at a time when the steady state theory, the Big Bang, and the crunch were all competing to a degree, although, anyway, so I hedge my bets at the end of the universe. And below that is the story, a cultural story about pluralism, which starts with the Willendorf Venus and ends with E.H. Gombrich, who disappears underneath the thing. And he came once to the house and he said, "Oh, I always put people to sleep when I talk," which is rather nice anyway. It's thematic, it's designed around themes, and the themes are mostly to do with nature and the cosmos, mostly the cosmos. And that's been my interest from the beginning, remains.
Can we maybe talk a little bit more about London? Because I mean, one of the things we thought could be one of the sort of recurrence aspect of this marathon would be that we talk about London, and if there is such a thing as a theory of London, and I mean, certain cities have been sort of referred to permanently with definitions, but is it possible to define London?
And I would like to complicate the question by asking whether you think London, which is about to undergo a huge transformation with a lot of kind of architectural additions by major, presumably iconic architects, do you think that the shapelessness of London will be enhanced or threatened by this future?
Oh dear. That's kind of an impossible question. Anyway, to impossible questions, one always has a kind of escape. But first of all, my belief about design in cities is that, and theories in cities, is that cities, you know, in a way are byproducts of economy. And like perspiration, when you run, you perspire. And when you have an economy, you have a city. And we should never forget that. So a city is I was saying to you, it's a parasite on the countryside. To a degree, 95% of the energy and food comes from outside, eats up the countryside and pollutes everything. So it's this kind of it's unconscious process of economy and people drawn to it for those sort of reasons, cultural and economic and social. And then after it gets a consciousness of itself and it has various catastrophes, it keeps restructuring itself from the very beginning. So it's redesigned, and you get a mayor, for instance, Livingston, or the mayor of Barcelona, who says we must grip the congestion or X or Y. And then you get an outburst of plans and redesign, and then it sinks back into, into the perspiration mode of not. So I think a city is a sometime design and sometimes letting go. And it's never been totally controlled, like the economy's never been. So architects have a completely false view of this for very good reasons. They want to make work, they want to convince society they're in charge of the city and they can do something. And they maybe design 3% of it or 2%, maybe influence 30 to 40%, but it's always out of control. And we're always trying to make it better. I'm not against design at all. I'm all in favor of it, but I think we have a false consciousness about talking about it. One of the iconic buildings, and I have in my pocket here the most iconic building ever designed, the last 15 minutes, which is the Tate, modern, right? It just appeared. And it's amazing that it's made it onto the yeah, okay. I mean, anyone who hasn't seen this hasn't been either reading the papers or seeing television, okay? Now that's incredible that from a unself-conscious, background for architects to suddenly Herzog, basically, and de Meuron have jumped onto the iconic bandwagon and with Nick Sirota and managed to convince 90% of the elite critics that we really need this kind of Frank Gehry icon. Frank designed one of these, cubic buildings for Nîmes in 1985, was beaten by Norman Foster. But it's that kind of building, which Herzog said is freaky on the one hand, And then he said is very much designed from the inside out, you know, a series of cubes, 50 cubes. He didn't say, but there are 50 cubes there. Now, 50 white cubes on the outside and 80 white cubes on the inside. 130 white cubes. If you read the theory of the white cube in art, you know, read Brian O'Doherty, Patrick Ireland, on the white cube, you know, modernism stuck a white cube into art and more or less killed the art object. And having 130 of them is maybe over white cubism. You know, it's white cubism cubed. Do we, which is not to criticize it, because as Sirota says, you know, why can't art, finally, the cathedral of our time, the cliche since the 80s, why can't it be an icon rather than just commercial buildings? Absolutely right. I think that the argument from content is that if you're having an icon, let's have it there. And it's certainly a typical iconic building because it's completely enigmatic and not a pyramid. It's a non-pyramid series. You know, it's that famous phrase about the nude descending the staircase. It's an explosion in a shingle factory. It's a series of, you know, little white cubes that are exploding over each other and made out of this amazing Herzog glass. So, well,
maybe that's almost a nice conclusion. We have actually one more question. I was wondering if you have any kind of dreams for London, any kind of projects you dream of?
Or yourself an unrealized project?
Yeah, or projects, yeah, which you try to realize, which for all kinds of reasons have been unrealized, so that can also be realizable.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, Rem accused me of being dogmatic, and I am dogmatic about the cosmogenic. I really think that the universe project is what I'm committed to. How about that as a project? The unfinished project, to quote someone, of the universe, 13.7 billion years old. It is really the ultimate referent, and I think it's a collective project, and I'm interested in working with all sorts of different kinds of people, scientists and artists, craftsmen, architects, designers, builders, to reroute our culture in an understanding, as Gauguin painted, where we come from, who we are, and where we're going. And in that universe project, it seems to me it's fundamental that cosmogenesis, like the Genesis myth, is the operating manual for, solar system, our local solar system. So, yes, that's an unfinished project that I'm very committed to.
Many, many thanks to Jencks. Thank you.